How are you guys doing today? People say, well, Jesus never existed. That Jesus was like the Easter bunny, and like some mythical land far, far away. Atheists who say this are not very familiar with history. History, and the Gospels is a historical text as well, has survived longer than any other text. Shows outside of the gospel that there was somebody called Jesus. He did die by Pilate's hands. He was known to be the Christ, and he was known to do miracles. It says astounding miracles. And he was crucified. So I'm just going to read some stuff, historical texts, and it's pretty amazing. The source I'm getting, there's so many sources out there, but just Google historical texts of Jesus from non-Christian sources, and you'll see a ton of stuff. So let's start. Ready? All right. AD 64. Nero had set on fire Rome because he was crazy. He was just insane. He was killing people left and right. He was doing a lot of weird stuff. And he blamed the Christians after people were like wanting to point fingers. Why did somebody set on fire the capital of our country, of our nation? And Nero knew who was in trouble. So what did he do? He was sane enough to try to not take the blame. And he pointed the fingers at the quote, the Christians, the evil Christians, those house-burning Christians who destroy and go rampaging around. Anyways, the quote is here. It's written by the historian Tacitus, a Greek historian, Roman historian during Nero's time. And he says, Nero fastened the guilt on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace, and Tacitus wasn't a Christian. So he's just giving a historical account. He's saying, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, Greek word for Christ, Christos, beautiful name, Messiah. It says, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius. During the reign of Tiberius, that's when Pontius Pilate was in charge of Jerusalem. That's when Jesus was crucified. It says he suffered during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. We could read that in the Gospels. And we could also read that in history. And a most mischievous superstition. So he was crucified by Pilate. He suffered by Pilate. And they say he had supernatural powers. And it's called mischievous superstitions. Because, they weren't believers. If somebody was healing the sick, that's how they would describe it if they didn't believe in him. Thus checked for the moment, again, broke out only in Judea, the first source of evil, but the event in Rome. So he's just talking about the event that took place, the burning of Rome. The Christians were blamed who followed Christus, who had supernatural powers, and he was put to death during the reign of Tiberius by Pontius Pilate. So Jesus did exist, and they called him Christ. And he had, quote, superstition powers. Okay, here's another source by Pliny the Young. Horrible name, Pliny the Young. Hey, Pliny the Young. Not a good name to give your boy. But this is a scholar during that time period. This is what he writes. Talking about Christians, followers of Christ. They, referring to Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day. Obviously, we do the same thing. First day of the week. Before it was light, that's when they came together. During this time period, there was a lot of persecution, so they met, secret, and in the dark, a lot of times in catacombs. It was not a safe time to be a Christian. It says, when they sang in alternative verses a hymn to Christ. And they say they played the guitar and the piano, and it said they sang. And that's the historical, if you go research historical records of the New Testament church. A lot of people, I've talked to people who say, oh, no, they had the tambourines and harps and all that. No. In the New Testament century, when Christ established the church, all the historical records say sing and nothing else. If there was something else, it would say something else. So it says they got together to sing verses of hymns to Christ as a God, lowercase. Again, this guy wasn't a Christian. And bound themselves by solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds, but to never commit any fraud, theft, or adultery. Never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust they should be called upon to deliver. They were honest, they had integrity, they did not betray the name of Christ. So they had a good standing even by unbelievers who called Christ the lowercase God. So they during this time, Christ was known, the Christians were known because these Christians followed Christ. After which it was their custom to separate. After they assembled, they separated. And then they reassembled, to partake of food. But food of an ordinary and innocent kind. What is the unleavened bread? It's food, is it not? What is the fruit of the vine? It's food. It doesn't say they had a feast. It doesn't say they had a banquet. It said they assembled together to partake of food that was ordinary and innocent of kind. What does it say in 1 Corinthians 11? When you come together to partake of the fruit of the vine, unleavened bread, and do this in remembrance of me. And how often you do this, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So, they partook of food, innocent and ordinary, where they assembled. Another interesting thing during this time period, by the Testonium Flavian, this astounding brief reference that talks about Christ. And this was written, again, during the time period of Jesus Christ. Okay, during the time period of the apostles, during this historical text, during a time period of the foundational building of the early church. But this time, the quote says, again, there lived Jesus. That means he lived. A wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. So this historian was like, is he or is he not? Because the proofs during that time period were hard not to deny. It's hard to deny something when you see God healing the lame, the blind, walking and talking, the power that he expressed during that time period. By this time there lived Jesus, wise man, if indeed one ought to call a man wise, and if indeed one ought to call him a man. Where he wrought surprising feats. Yeah, he did. These are historical texts. It says Jesus did miracles. He was had supernatural stuff. It says he wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. This historical person saw Jesus doing surprising feats. And he was called the Christ. People called him the Christ during that time period because that's who he claimed he was. When Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him did not give up their affection for him. So Christ lived, he did miraculous feats, surprising feats. He was called the Christ. Jesus was called Christ. And he was crucified. From uninspired men, the Bible speaks these things. And people did not lose their love for him. On the third day he appeared restored to life, and the tribe of Christians has not disappeared. Keep in mind this is from a secular person who heard about these things, saw certain things, and wrote them down. Miraculous feats. He was called the Christ. This Jesus was crucified. The tribe of Christians will not disappear. They were there during that point, and he believed that they would endure despite the persecution. And he said Jesus rose. He wasn't inspired by the Holy Spirit, but during that time period, the things he saw caused him to believe, and he wrote it down in history that Jesus Christ rose from the grave. Pretty cool. Here's another thing. That Talmud, 70 A.D. Yes, he wrote it during the destruction of Jerusalem. For your old 70 A.D. Doctrine people, he wrote it during the destruction of Jerusalem. And there's no recording that Jesus came again, another coming during the destruction of Jerusalem, and laid waste to nations and all that stuff. No recording in history whatsoever. And you'll see here, he doesn't mention it either. Now, the 70 AD doctrine is where people say, Jesus came again. His second coming, we've missed the boat, folks. Jesus has already come in 70 AD, and he's already judged people. And his fire and his angels brought forth retribution. But here's a historical record we're about to talk about, and we've already talked about all these other records, and it's not mentioned that Christ came in flames of fire with angels and brought about vast cosmic change on the earth with destruction and destroying nations and punishing the wicked and lifting up the righteous to heaven. And that's not recorded in history, so it didn't happen. Okay, so just a little tangent, sorry, but people sometimes blow my mind. Just the things they come up with. Okay, in the case of the Talmud, the earliest period between AD 70 and it passed that even to AD 200. So this is a record here, okay, of what was recorded. The most significant reference of Jesus from this period states, on the eve of the Passover, again, Jesus partook of the Lord's Supper on the eve of Passover, from this historical writer who was not a Christian, Yashu, and Yashu, Greek means Jesus, was hanged for 40 days before the execution took place. A herald cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy." So this person, they called Yashu, before the execution took place, a herald cried that he was going to be stoned because he had practiced sorcery. So this is something that came from the Jewish histories. People that wrote it down hated Christ. They called him a sorcerer and apostate to Israel. So these people didn't like the guy. But they called him Yashu, which means Jesus. And he was hanged. And obviously they got some stuff incorrect. But still, that's pretty relevant if that's what happened. And just a little bit more on this topic. The Talmud, written by Jewish historians. Let's give some context to this. Hanged is the same way for crucified. Paul writes about this, "Cursed is anyone who's hung on the tree," referring to Christ. He was hung on the cross, which is wood, which is a tree. And then it says that he if this didn't happen, let's read this again. Besides calling him a sorcerer, an apostate, the herald who is crying out about Jesus, he says he's going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. So the goal was to have him hung. And if that didn't work, the Jews would try to stone him a couple Let's see. I think they tried to stone him twice. Seized him in the temple, and when he was in his hometown, they tried to seize him as well. So it wasn't a novel concept that they weren't trying to stone him. They did try to stone him, and they were. If this didn't work out, if they would try to stone him again. But it could also be in a symbolic language. And again, it's a historical thing. It's not an inspired thing. So it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. But when somebody sins and claims to be God in the Old Testament, they were stoned. So it could have been a symbolic thing. He was crucified. When it's talking about that, it could just mean, well, because he blasphemed God, he's getting his punishment that the old law talks about. He's being, quote, stoned. He's being punished. So it could be referring to that as well. But again, it's not an inspired text. It doesn't really matter much. It just points out that Jesus existed, and the people who hated him called him apostate, called him just a sorcerer. Now, why would they call him a sorcerer? Now, if somebody is doing miracles and you don't believe in them, then you would call them something other than something good, right? Call them a sorcerer, a witch, a warlock. If you're seeing them heal people, if you're seeing profound things taking place, turning water to wine, raising the dead, a voice coming from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, whom I'm well pleased." If you experienced any of these things and you had a hard heart and you refused to accept Christ, then you would call him something other than what he was. You would say, "This is Beelzebub, the prince of the demons, by which he drives out demons." You would call him something evil instead of something good. No matter how beautiful a person is in expressing God's divine truth and his miracles, mind the apostles were all killed as well, there will be people who refuse to believe, and people who try to kill them, and people who do. And the same way with Jesus, and people who slander them for their good works, their miracles, and the testimony that comes forth from them by the Holy Spirit. So that's just some Jewish stuff, calling him apostate. Here's another thing by Lucian of Samostia. He was a 2nd century Greek satirist. In one of his works, he wrote of the early Christian folks. He says, "The Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. He introduced novel things, love thy enemy. He introduced novel things. If you look at lust at a woman, it's the same as adultery. He introduced novel things. Seek ye first the kingdom of God," where people were seeking first their own interests. And it says, killed for that. The Christians worship a man, distinguished personage, who introduced their novel rites and was crucified for that on that account. What he taught, what the Christians worshipped, that man was crucified. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from that moment, that they were converted. When we are converted, we become part of Christ's family. It talks about that in Galatians chapter 3. Let's see, verse 25 to 27. This beautiful thing, that those who are baptized into Christ clothe themselves with Christ, and by faith that we are God's family. So it's an amazing thing. And so that's what the Gospels teach, what the epistles teach. It's what this historian said Jesus exemplified and reflected during that history time period. It was impressed by their original lawgiver that they're all brothers. Who's the lawgiver? Jesus. He brought forth the Gospels, the truth, the law, the spiritual law. From that moment, they were all converted and denied the gods of Greece and worshiped their crucified sage and lived after his laws. So, who's the sage? Jesus. Who was crucified? Jesus. Who followed Jesus? Christians. And this is written by a non-Christian. So Jesus did live during this time period. He lived, he died, he was crucified, and these accounts say he did miracles. He did, quote, sorcery. He did mischievous supernatural things. So obviously he did things that they couldn't account for, so they had to demonize it. Talks about him saying standards of truth, to not commit adultery, to not murder, to not do theft, by these historians. Would a demon speak such? And that this person, they call them good and wise, the Christians are a brotherhood because of this. And they follow this wise person. So he died for us. It says he was crucified. He taught the right things. He was demonized. But again, by their fruits you will know them. Matthew 7. And his fruits were to heal, to cure, to bring forth life and goodness. And his testimony was also a reflection of that. To be drawn closer to God, to be drawn closer to love for the brotherhood of life and a spiritual brotherhood of the faith, of the truth, of the church. Now, Satan wouldn't promote that. Evil wouldn't promote that. Demonic forces would not promote that. But they say he did supernatural things. They say he did sorcery. So if he did all these miracles, they even them didn't refute that it was false. They said he did these things, that he lived. And we see that he did speak amazing, profound truths to exalt and amplify the Spirit, make it more closer to God, and help us get closer to a relationship with the Father. If he's doing these things, that means he's coming from the right place. His teachings and his actions are a reflection that it's coming from a divine place, not a satanic place. And that the proofs are in his stories that he did do supernatural things, that we actually should believe in Jesus, not just because the Gospels say so, but because of his stories of uninspired men who did not believe in Jesus Christ said that Jesus did these things. That's it. Again, Google what I said and find all the texts, a lot of texts, historical texts that prove that Jesus lived, that Jesus died, that Jesus was crucified, that Jesus was called the Christ, that Jesus did miracles. God bless you. Take care.